Welcome to HP at Church, a podcast about Harry Potter and the Bible. This is our 5th episode in the time after Pentecost, also known as Ordinary Time. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
In this episode, we'll discuss the 12th through 14th Sundays after Pentecost. This episode, we have 2 content notifications for you. First, on the first Sunday of our episode, the 12th Sunday after Pentecost, for the first reading, we have a conversation about an adult grooming a child, theoretically, and possibly in the books. And then for the 13th Sunday after Pentecost, in the second reading, from Philemon, we talk extensively about slavery and dehumanization of Indigenous people and people of African descent and people of color broadly.
If you want to follow along on our blog, it's hpatchurch, hpatchurch.wordpress.com, and you can find links to the Bible passages we're using and more information on other references we make in this episode.
Our first Sunday for this episode is the 12th Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Proper 17, also known as Lectionary 22, which this year falls on the 1st of September, so some people may miss it because they're catching the train to Hogwarts.
I didn't even make that connection until just now.
Our first reading for that Sunday is Proverbs chapter 25, verses 6 through 7. From a collection of wisdom in the Hebrew Scriptures, this proverb on being humble is one of the many passages referenced by Jesus in the Gospels.
So this proverb, one of the main themes, is a caution against thinking too highly of oneself. I know we usually go to a certain Defense Against the Dark Arts professor for this, but I'm going to go to a different Defense Against the Dark Arts professor for this.
Look at us and our wildly changing methods of diversity, yes.
Yeah. So instead of talking about Lockhart, the piece of it that really stuck out to me was Umbridge and particularly her speech at the beginning of the school year at the welcome feast. As Dumbledore's talking, she thinks highly enough of herself to interrupt the headmaster as he speaks and then proceed to give a speech, which is out of step for any professor probably ever in the history of the school. Right. That is not a thing that is done. But she's like, I'm so important.
And I might even say that I think that your choice of Umbridge instead of Lockhart makes way more sense, because this passage isn't just about thinking too highly of oneself, but also about being seen to think too highly of oneself. I'm pretty sure that Umbridge thinks just about as highly of herself as Lockhart does of himself, but she is trying to not be seen that way, even though she also kind of fails miserably.
Interesting. She is just trying to be
she
seen
wants to
as
come across as less, as not horrifically arrogant, at least, or just self-confident. She fails, but she tries.
Yeah. Well, and I think what's interesting, right, is that frequently, and I think for both Lockhart and Umbridge, thinking so highly of yourself is actually a way of hiding the deep insecurities that they both rightfully have.
Oh, yeah.
Right, Lockhart is completely incompetent at any spell except for a memory charm.
Right.
And any spell having to do with keeping his hair looking good. And then Umbridge is, put in a position, not because there's a need for that particular position, not because she has any competency whatsoever or any desire to actually teach, but in fact so that nothing is learned.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just the epitome of this proverb.
Mm-hmm. Pretty much.
Speaking of, so funnily enough, we both picked the same verses to talk about.
Possibly because there are only 2 of them. Is that a binary?
Minor detail. No, there's just 2 of them.
Okay.
It's like a duality.
Yes.
We're not pitting them against each other, so they're not necessarily a binary.
Well, I don't know. We haven't talked about them yet. Let's wait and see.
Oh, that's true. So in verse 6, I was struck by the part particularly that says, do not put yourself forward or stand in the place of the great, and thinking about Draco on the train, especially on the train, but throughout Half-Blood Prince, when he is bragging about being very important, and like really he's bragging about being a Death Eater,
Right.
but without actually like saying those words because he can't technically admit to it because he has a feeling that Harry's there and it's just not smart to admit to.
Right.
And so he's like bragging about like how important he is when the reality is he's only in this position because Voldemort is trying to get payback on his dad for messing up so very much at the Ministry of Magic.
And I think an example of people in the books not putting themselves forward might be Harry and Hermione when they attend Slug Club.
Ooh.
They are not putting themselves forward. Now, humility is a part of the reason for that, but also there are other reasons, like they aren't entirely sure that they want to be there in the first place. So it's not just humility in that case, but they are way more humble than Slughorn would certainly expect them to be, or Slughorn would probably be in their situation.
Well, and Ginny, too. Let's not forget Ginny, because she earned her way into the Slug Club in a way that Harry did not.
Right.
And still, she's like, I don't want to be in this.
Yeah. And it's not like we can blame her. So.
Not at all. And on the flip side of that, right, is verse 7, where we have the wisdom that it is better to be told, come up here, than to be told to move down. And I was thinking of Hagrid for that. I mean, Hagrid always got to sit at the staff table because he was always on staff. But there is a very clear way that after his name is cleared, there is this honor bestowed upon him by Dumbledore to say, come up here and be a professor because you know this subject so well. And he's like not the worst at it. He's just, you know, maybe a little more advanced than people should be. But he's not the worst teacher at Hogwarts.
No, he's very practical. And as the child of two parents who both spent many, many years working in post-secondary education, I would also point out that every school, from preschool on through university, has a bit of a binary, I might say, between staff and faculty.
Mm.
They aren't always pitted against each other, but they are two very different classes. And it is the rare, rare soul that has ever belonged to both of them. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, watching that happen and watching that slight tension play out in the books was really interesting for me, because I grew up hearing those stories, because both of my parents were staff.
Mm.
So, and then I also looked at verse 7 and thought to myself, sometimes you'd rather not be told come up here at all, because there's no nobility in it. It's better to be told to come up here by a noble than to be told the opposite. But it's not just about being noble as in being rich and powerful and possibly slightly royal. It's also nobility as in grace and magnanimity of heart, I think, is one of my favorite definitions of what nobility truly is, as a character trait rather than as a social status.
That fits really well with Gryffindor, I think. The noble of heart. Nobility is part of Gryffindor.
Being magnanimous, I might personally identify more with Hufflepuff than with Gryffindor. The Gryffindors are like brave of heart and
but nobility is, I think, like being noble is one of the.
I think being noble is definitely a characteristic that could be shared by both Gryffindor and Hufflepuff. Well, I mean, I think anybody can really be noble.
Well, yes, anyone can be noble because the house divisions are totally made up. Right. But I think that, like, when we think about being noble, I think, like, the way that we think about the word noble and nobility is more of a Gryffindor thing. What I'm saying is I like the idea that, like, perhaps there's more than just reckless bravery involved in being a part of Gryffindor.
I like that idea, too. I would question.
I was just pointing out that you are, in fact, a Hufflepuff, and I am a Gryffindor.
Yes, and I think that might be the basis of our little disagreement here. Whereas for me, part of nobility is the aspiration to egalitarianism that is a central part of Hufflepuffness. Hufflepuffleness? Hufflepufflety?
Hufflepuffleness. I like Hufflepuffleness. But I don't think nobility is a, like, what did you say?
Egalitarian?
Yeah. I don't think nobility is egalitarian. There's an inherent difference in people to be like there's an inherent power difference, I think.
I've always thought of nobility as being willing to help or help lift up or so on. Literally anybody. It doesn't matter who you are. There's an egalitarianness to that. But okay. Anyway, my point is actually has nothing to do with the definition of nobility. But I was saying that sometimes you'd rather not be told to come up here at all. Like, for example, when there is no nobility in it, and no matter what your definition of nobility is, I think one example of someone in the Harry Potter books being told to come up here and not wanting that to happen, and there is no nobility in it, is when Harry is being fawned over by Lockhart and freaks. Yeah. Because he does not want to be associated with Lockhart in anybody's mind, and Lockhart is pushing the subject, and also in a fairly creepy and kind of grooming kind of way. Like, I don't know that we acknowledge that a lot, but there's something weird going on there about a grown man being that to a 12-year-old. I object.
Well, okay, I think that if we're going to get into a conversation about grooming, like, there's inappropriate relationships with 12-year-olds, Hagrid probably takes the cake.
Well, yes, okay, do not encourage 12-year-olds to commit felonies. I am entirely in favor of that, too.
You know. But I think there's a fanfic that I read, I don't remember what it's called, but it's like Harry, at the age of like 20-something, goes through the veil, and instead of dying, it actually like sends him back to when he's 11 years old.
Oh, you've mentioned this one before.
Yeah, and there's this way that he interacts
Cartography? Something?
Yes, Cartographer's Craft.
Okay.
Cartographer's Craft, which I can link to. But there's a way in which, in Cartographer's Craft, he does a really good job of interacting with Lockhart and realizing it's not that Lockhart is like grooming him in some creepy way, it's that Lockhart is trying to get him to like understand how he can have more influence in the way that he can influence people. So then when they can then relate on that level, they actually like work well together. But because Harry has like no concept whatsoever when he's 12 years old of like influencing people or popularity being anything except for super uncomfortable, he doesn't experience it the same way in the original books.
I could see that. Okay, cool.
Our second reading for this Sunday is from Hebrews chapter 13, verses 1 through 8 and 15 through 16. The author finishes their letter by giving instructions on how to live together in loving community, inspired and nurtured by the love God shows to us in Jesus Christ. Part of living together in loving community that is articulated in Hebrews is faithfulness in daily life. Our last episode we talked a lot about faith, but there's a distinction, I think, in between faith on a macro level and then faithfulness in daily life. And I think Hagrid really demonstrates faithfulness in daily life throughout the books, but particularly thinking about in Order of the Phoenix when Umbridge goes to sack him during the astronomy OWLs and brings her goon squad with her. They attack Hagrid, and then they attack also Fang and McGonagall, who comes to investigate the ruckus. And Hagrid's faithfulness is not just to himself, and not even just to Fang, but also like to McGonagall and the way that he gets upset when McGonagall's hurt and when Fang is hurt. Right. And then when he leaves, he doesn't just leave Fang there. He picks Fang up and runs away with Fang. So that's one example. Or like in Deathly Hallows, when there's the rumors of him having a like support Harry Potter party, which is maybe not like the wisest form of faithfulness in daily life, but there is a way that it's just like the epitome of Hagrid's faithfulness to Harry. Like
# on brand. Yeah.
Yes. And speaking of Deathly Hallows, in verse 3 we read, "Remember those who are in prison as though you were in prison with them. Those who are being tortured as though you were being tortured." And that reminded me of Potter Watch and the way that Potter Watch, at least the like one episode that we get of it, makes room to remember not only the witches, wizards, and wizches that are killed or harmed, but also the muggles who they don't even always know the names of, but to truly remember them and to remember the violence that is being done to so many different people.
And as we have seen in so many both historic and current situations, the verbal, out loud, and continued remembrance of those people themselves can be an act of rebellion.
Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh. We were just talking about that the other day, of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, Madres de Plaza de Mayo, who in the moment during the dictatorship when their children were being disappeared and their grandchildren, they started walking because they were the only ones who could walk and not be killed because they were older women. And they, every Thursday, would show up and walk around in circles in Plaza de Mayo. And they still do that till today because their children are still disappeared because there weren't records of all of the people who were disappeared.
In verse 5, we hear, keep your lives free of the love of money. And certainly Arthur Weasley could have had a job that paid more. Certainly he could have gone after wealth for wealth's sake. Certainly Molly could have done the same. Or, for that matter, they could have been in a situation where she had to at least have some kind of paid job. Although it doesn't seem they were. Or they both could have pushed their kids specifically to go after jobs because they paid well, again, wealth for wealth's sake. But instead, they did what they loved, and they encouraged their children to do the same. Now, yes, I know Emily's going to bring up that they had doubts about Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, but in that case, I would say I read their doubts about that being more about the financial risk that the twins were taking, and that they knew that if the twins failed at that, they wouldn't be able to help the twins very much. And I also think that being careful about financial risk isn't the same as loving money.
Yeah, that's really real, and I think that is super on point, because it is like the twins are the easy go-to for like, no, they did want their kids to make money, and they were proud when Percy went into the ministry, but part of that was that Percy wanted to. I don't know that they were just opposed to Weasley's Wizard Wheezes because of financial risk, because I think they did want their kids to achieve not just like not to have great financial risk, but to achieve
stability,
some sort of stability, which is something that they struggled with.
Right.
And so, but that's still not
wealth for wealth's sake.
Yeah, it's not wealth for wealth's sake, and so there is a distinction there. But that's beautiful.
And because we don't always agree with the lectionary writers about what they choose to include or not, I also have a comment to make on verses 11 through 13, which are not officially included in the reading for this particular Sunday, but you may wind up hearing them anyway, who knows. So when we get to verses 11 through 13, there is this whole bit about, let us go to Jesus outside the camp's boundaries. This passage is about how Jesus sacrificed himself not only to save us from our sins, but also to save us from rules that do not give life. It's not that we live without rules. We have rules. Rules are helpful. But we live with them out of gratitude and because they help us be better people, not out of fear of God's wrath, because Jesus has dismissed that fear. Much like how Hagrid loves magical creatures, but follows the rules for interacting with them, not out of fear, but out of the joy that those rules allow him to have a relationship with them. Like he knows to be respectful to hippogriffs, but he's not respectful to them because he fears what they can do to him, although they certainly could hurt him. But he's respectful to them in order to have that relationship with them.
Like with centaurs, too, I think it's also a really good one where there's a deep respect there. Yeah, and I think part of what Jesus responds to, right, it's not that, and I think it's important to name this as Christians, it's not that Jesus is saying the Old Testament is terrible and it's all just old rules that oppress people.
Right.
Because that
is not true.
Frequently a narrative an anti-Semitic narrative that Christians perpetuate. But the ways that we as humans of all stripes, have guidelines and then build more rules on them and more rules and more rules,
that can get ridiculous.
And I think
ridiculous.
Yes. Can definitely get ridiculous and is not, what God desires for any of us. And I don't think any religion really would say these are the rules that you have to follow or else I think when there are rules, it's like you were saying about Jesus' encouragement to follow particular rules, is that it's about...
It needs to be life-giving.
Yeah, it's about what is life-giving.
Right. And so, like, if you choose a rule for yourself and you do find it life-giving, like Jewish people and Muslim people choose not to eat pork, they cut that bit of possible life out of their lives as a way to follow God. And they do find it life-giving because it's part of how they acknowledge their faith on a everyday, ordinary basis.
Yeah, agreed. Returning to the part that was included in the lectionary, the only reason that I don't ever get this is that I literally am looking through a book that has them all. So I have a book that includes all of the Revised Common Lectionary readings, and so it just has the lectionary readings. It doesn't have any of the context, any of the other stuff. And so...
Yes. Whereas I prefer reading the actual Bible. So...
Yeah. Or you follow the links that I make that include the missing verses every time.
Which involves reading the actual Bible. Of course, you're doing that too, but anyway.
We're both reading the actual Bible. You cannot say the internet is the actual Bible.
The internet is just as much the actual Bible as a book that only has the lectionary readings.
I know, but you're implying that it's more the actual Bible.
I was having a little fun with you, yes.
Mm-hmm. Anywho, so in verse 16... we're told, do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, which, is just your average plan for socialism. I was thinking about, like, who actually does that, and, of course, Hagrid shares his food. The Weasleys always follow this. Always. But then I was thinking also that Sirius...
Well, except for the twins demanding that Ron pay for his purchases, but,
That's like sibling rivalry.
Yeah.
But then, and they take an extra nut off. In the books, in the movie, they raise the price, but in the books, they take off the extra nut.
Yes.
But then I was thinking about this, and I think in the books, Sirius really embodies this. I mean, he doesn't want Grimmauld Place, so it's a little bit different, though, like, he doesn't want the possession in the first place.
Yeah.
But he shares it especially at Christmas time, I think is when it's most clear in Order of the Phoenix that he opens his home to the Weasleys and Harry and Hermione and just is sharing everything and is working so hard to be so generous and so loving. And that, like, falls off pretty quickly after Christmas, after the first day of Christmas is over. But there's this one space where he actually gets to do that in the books. Because most of the other time he's either dead, imprisoned, or on the run.
He has some stuff going on, yeah. It also reminds me of Harry sharing his money to buy treats at the first train ride in the first book.
Yeah.
Our gospel reading for this Sunday is from Luke chapter 14, verses 1, followed by verses 7 through 14. At a banquet, Jesus encourages guests to show humility rather than ambition, and to put more effort toward those who are in need of it than those who would be able to return the favor.
So one of the things that's underlying the whole conversation that Jesus is having with folks is the sense of honor and shame that is a fundamental part of the culture that Jesus is in, where honor is a really big deal and shame is a really big deal. And there are clear things. It's very much a binary of, like, you do things and are honor and receive honor, or you do things and receive shame, or you do things and shame other people or give them honor. But, like, those are your two options, and everything you do plays into honor and shame, especially in the public sphere. And so I was thinking about honor and shame and disgrace, and of course there is no better line about that than Arthur Weasley in Chamber of Secrets talking to Lucius, who says, "Oh, I certainly hope they're paying you well for all these extra raids." And then he looks at Ginny's secondhand books and says, "But judging by these books, probably not. What's the point in disgracing the name of wizard if they don't even pay you for it?" And Arthur's beautiful comeback is, "We have a very different idea of what disgraces the name of wizard, Malfoy." And I just love that. And that's, like, it's in the movies, and I couldn't really figure out if it is. I don't think it's not exactly in the books, but it so beautifully embodies what it means for Arthur Weasley to be who he is, and the way that the Weasley family in particular embody a different way of honor and shame.
Yeah.
And embody what it means to try to be allies and advocates with Muggleborns and Muggles.
Yeah.
In a way that's like this beautiful, admirable thing that we don't really get from too many other people in the books. Like, the Weasley family really is one of the best ones to follow, to think about how we are and are not allies to people. And they're not perfect, but I think they do a good job of continuously working towards that.
I also love that moment because that moment gives me the concept that I would totally be willing to read a series of books about Arthur and Lucius's time at Hogwarts. Because you get the feeling from that meeting that they totally went to school together, and this is a very, very old, not exactly rivalry, but difference of opinion. We love talking about the Marauders so much, but Arthur and Lucius are about half a generation above them, older than them, and I would totally be interested in seeing that.
Yeah, that is fascinating because they are older. Because we know that like Snape is hanging out with Lucius and some older Death Eaters.
Right. Well, and Arthur and Molly are noticeably older than the Marauders, than Sirius and Remus. So yeah,
they were having kids when the others were in school still, I think.
So again, I ignore the fact that the lectionary people chopped out a few verses there. Because I love this passage of verse 1 through 14, because I think it's really all about the same thing, which I'll get to again in a minute. But for verses 1 through 4, which are about healing on the Sabbath, this is one of those situations where I love these verses. Because if Molly Weasley was cleaning for Bill's wedding, and one of her kids walked into the area that the ceremony was going to happen in an hour before the ceremony, and they were spurting blood from an injury or something, which, with the twins being around, that's always a possibility.
And Charlie and Bill's work, and yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Highly likely.
Charlie is less likely to get attacked by a dragon at his brother's wedding, but you never know. It could happen, sure. But her first reaction to if that happened would be to heal them, right? Because it's not about whether or not the place looks pretty, it's about family, it's about people. Yes, she would probably freak out immediately afterwards and start re-cleaning after the emergency was over. That's fine. But she would do the healing first. That's the part that matters.
So I skipped over the healing, although I agree. I think a lot of the time, the things that the lectionary cuts out are... Sometimes it makes sense. Most of the time, I'm like, just leave it in. Like, we get a better sense of the scope of Jesus' ministry and the scope, particularly in the Gospels, of how the Gospels engage with Jesus when we get to read a more consistent or continuous one. On my blog, I've actually been like, my first question almost every time is, what did we skip? Or what's missing? Because the premise is that we're going through the Gospel of Luke, but we're skipping things all over the place. Right. So I was looking at verse 7 and the guests choosing the places of honor for themselves and thinking about Percy, who I think would choose places of honor. He might not go to the very top, but he would choose a place maybe that's a little bit higher up than he actually is to get the connections and the potential for those positions. And we see this a little bit when he is working for Mr. Crouch, for Barty Crouch. Right. And Barty Crouch is just like phoning it in, basically. But it's not even him phoning it in. And Percy is so enamored with the power and the authority and responsibility that he's getting that he doesn't tell anybody about this, and like feels very comfortable showing up at the Yule Ball as the representative and sitting at the head table and being a judge, which is just like, there's no way, like, a couple years out of Hogwarts and you're a judge at the Triwizard Tournament. I don't think so.
But I also think that when he's an adult, like a full-on adult who has reached a certain level of maturity, which he really hasn't in the books. I mean, he's legally an adult, but there's a stage of young adulthood there.
Yeah,
that
so you're like 25-ish.
Yeah. When he's an adult, I think he would be, of all the Weasleys, if you wanted somebody to set up a seating chart for a banquet, Percy would be the perfect choice. because he's going to be able to not only know all the different relationships and so on involved, but he's actually going to be able to and willing to voice why someone should sit in one place and not in another, or shouldn't sit next to a certain person, in ways that I think the other Weasleys would be wildly uncomfortable with saying out loud. You know?
Yeah,
in part, I think that's because of his experience.
Yeah, I could see that. I also think he would be one of the ones... I would hope that by the time he gets to that mature place, he would also be one who could strategically seat people so that you get a little bit, like, you get seated with a little bit of a leg up. That there's a little, there's like
I could see
one seat
really
at each table for someone who's just a little bit below the level of that table, to give them just like a little leg up. And I would hope that he would use that power of his and that insight of his for the good of those who are underrepresented.
Yeah.
It depends on... I need to read some Percy fanfic from after the end of the books to see how he atones for his sins.
Now you're just trying to bait me.
For our listeners / watchers out there who can't see our faces, I definitely had a mischievous look on my face just then. It was great.
Yeah. And for those who haven't been longtime fans of the show, I am a Percy fan. I make no secret of it. We will eventually get our bingo game out there so you guys can play. So,
anyway, so in verses 8 through 10, Jesus is really talking to the Malfoys. Like I just used Percy as an example, but in reality, like when Jesus is talking to folks about where they're choosing to sit and at which tables and stuff, Jesus is talking to the Malfoys. He's talking to the ones with power and privilege and prestige and who think very highly of themselves. He's not talking to the Weasleys. And I think too frequently in the church, we can forget that who Jesus' audience is matters a lot. A lot of the time,
right,
Jesus is talking to the poor and the oppressed. And if we use those same words to talk to the rich, privileged white folk, like, both of us, we are doing harm. And we are not actually, like, following the spirit of Jesus' call to follow him. And at the same time, when Jesus talks about things like carrying the cross or places of honor and encouraging people to serve others, he's not talking to the ones who are already stuck serving because they are enslaved or oppressed. He's talking to the ones who have the power and privilege to have servants and to have enslaved people serving them, to say, you need to do this. And we'll get into that in our next Sunday in our Philemon conversation, but Jesus' audience matters a ton, and we don't always pay attention to that.
Yeah.
So basically, Jesus is not telling the powerless to sit in the crappy seats.
I would agree with that, absolutely. And then in verse 13, hey, look, I'm actually in the part of the reading we're supposed to be in. I do try. Verse 13 is about inviting people to the banquet who are in need. I don't see this as separate from the move up higher bit of the reading or separate from the healing on the Sabbath part. They're all really saying the same thing. What matters is the people. One of the fanfics that I recommended to Emily a while back, which we've mentioned before, has a bit where Draco explains the very convoluted legal situation concerning his inheritance and how it's set up so that his death can actually protect all the stuff he'll inherit instead of endangering it, to which Harry replies, I didn't inherit anything from my parents that was more important than my life. Now, Draco is partly interested in protecting his inheritance because that affects real-life people, but I think both parts, it's about the people. It's about helping people, and that is a consistent theme throughout this whole reading, even the part that the lectionary people didn't want to talk about.
Yeah.
It's somewhere in A.J. Hall's gigantic universe, the Lobiverse.
Ah, okay. So our next Sunday is the 13th Sunday after Pentecost, which is also known as Proper 18, also known as Lectionary 23, which falls on September 8th this year. Our first reading is Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 15 through 20. Moses reminds the Israelites that their choices matter. They can choose what God has pointed out as good and life-giving, and live the life that leads to. Or they can choose what isn't, and deal with those consequences. So, a very obvious theme here is life and death. And once again, you've been like, for the record, I think that you have been goading me, especially the first reading from the first Sunday of this episode, where you were like, is this a binary? Is this a binary? Is this? So, I'm not the only one goading.
That's fair. I have occasionally been known to
goad.
To do that sort of thing.
That's true. So, the theme of life versus death is a binary that we frequently affirm in our culture. But even that is a false binary in Christianity, as we have Jesus triumphing over death and destroying the concepts of death and life as we know them. It's also a false binary in the magical world, because in the magical world there are ghosts and resurrection stones and priori incantatem and mirrors of Erised and all of these different things.
Even Horcruxes.
And Horcruxes that bend and break the ideas of what is life and aliveness and what is death. Well, and then as we get into this exploration of what it means to follow God's call to these life-giving ways of being, we hear from Moses in verse 16 that by observing God's commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous. And just to be very, very clear, in case it was not, we're talking here about God's decrees, not Umbridge's decrees. So much more life-giving than Umbridge's decrees, for sure.
Well, we're talking about Umbridge's decrees, but the Bible talks about God's.
Yeah. Yes. God's decrees, so much more life-giving than Umbridge's.
Absolutely. I noticed this is also one of those readings where we have both chosen this exact same verses to talk about again.
That's funny, and we have more than two choices this time.
Yes, exactly. But I read verse 16, and I asked myself, are the things that God says are good and life-giving because God says them? Or does God say them because they are good and life-giving?
No, the first beginning still didn't make sense to me.
God says that certain things are good and life-giving. Does God say them because they are good and life-giving? Or are they good and life-giving because God says them?
Ooh, that's like a parable. One of Jesus's tricky riddles.
Yes, I love Jesus's tricky riddles. And to translate it into a very weird, evil parallel in the Harry Potter books, are the things that Voldemort says evil and murderous because Voldemort says them? Or does he say them because he is evil and murderous? See, that one I would fall very hard on the second option. I think he says them because they are evil and murderous. Because he is evil and murderous.
Or to take it to a less evil but still complicated place, because Harry and Voldemort know at least a little bit about the prophecy, is it going to come true about them because they knew it? Or do they know it because it's going to come true about them? It's like the chicken and the egg.
Yeah, my answer to the chicken and the egg is always that I would like to have a chicken omelet now, please.
A chicken omelet?
You can put chicken in an omelet.
Oh, okay. I was like, why would you make an omelet out of chicken instead of out of eggs? I get what you're doing. If the answer is that Voldemort says them because he is evil and murderous, then would it follow that God says them because...
But the thing is that God is God, and therefore God created all the stuff that is good and life-giving, and therefore God is the ultimate expert on what is good and life-giving.
Right, so God says...
So all the stuff comes from God.
Things that are good and life-giving.
Because God is good and life-giving.
You know, not everything is good and life-giving. Just because everything comes from God does not make everything good and life-giving.
But God looked at all that God had created and said that it was good.
I know. And then we lived with it and twisted it to our own intentions. And
So did that part really come from God, or did it come from us?
but we came from God.
Sure. Hi, I'm a philosophy major. Are you having fun yet?
No. I mean, I'm not having that fun, but...
See, now you understand a tiny slice of what my husband's life is like.
Yeah. So as we continue in verse 19, we get this invitation that I love, and I still remember one of my dearly beloved professors preaching on this when I was in seminary, Reverend Cheryl Perrow. And verse 19, we get the invitation to choose life so that you and your descendants may live. And that's what Harry does. I mean, first he chooses death, and then he chooses life,
Right.
so that he and his descendants may live. But there was also this moment where I was thinking about it. I was like, well, of course, if you don't choose life, your descendants aren't going to live because you haven't had descendants yet. Like, they can't live if they're not born.
Sometimes God can be delightfully literal.
Yeah.
In verses 19 and 20, when I read these verses about the choice between life and death, I read them not as talking about heaven and hell, but more impacting the actual physical and emotional and spiritual lives that we have here and now. Like, for example, Harry made his choices not because he wanted to land in a particular afterlife, after all, who knows where that train goes, but because it would impact both his life and his descendants' lives, even if they aren't his biological descendants, as Emily so carefully points out. Our second reading for this Sunday is from Philemon, verses 1 through 21. Yes, that's right, there are no chapters in Philemon.
That's how short it is.
Yes. The shortest book in the Bible, Paul and his sibling in Christ, Onesimus, write to the man who thinks he owns Onesimus, appealing to the recipient to free Onesimus in celebration of the faith that all three share.
So, one of the themes that I find in this one that really stuck out to me when somebody did this as a scripture by heart was the decorum and the formality used to persuade. So we can read this book and read it as Paul just trying to oblige or trying to pressure or trying to force Philemon to free Onesimus. But there's also this propriety to it that really makes it where Paul sets up this space for, instead of being dishonored by freeing Onesimus, Philemon can receive extra honor for freeing Onesimus. And so that sense of decorum as a way of persuading reminded me of Dumbledore when he picks Harry up in Half-Blood Prince. He arrives at the Dursleys' home and assumes that Harry has told them that he's coming, but Harry, of course, did not, because he didn't trust Dumbledore, because he has no reason to trust that Dumbledore will do anything.
Yeah.
And then Dumbledore says, "Judging by your look of stunned disbelief, Harry did not warn you that I was coming. However, let us assume that you have invited me warmly into your house. It is unwise to linger over long on doorsteps in these troubled times." And so then he comes in, and then, Vernon is flustered and finally, starts to talk again, and he's like, "I don't mean to be rude." And Dumbledore interrupts him and is like, "Yet sadly, accidental rudeness occurs alarmingly often." Dumbledore finished the sentence gravely. "Best to say nothing at all, my dear man." And it just goes on, and he's like, "Well, shall we assume that you have invited me into your sitting room? I would assume," and then, ultimately it's, "I would assume that you were going to offer me refreshments," Dumbledore said to Uncle Vernon, "but the evidence so far suggests that would be optimistic to the point of foolishness." And so he provides his own refreshments. But it's just, thing after thing where Dumbledore is, the epitome of proper decorum and etiquette.
Yes.
And the Dursleys are just, stunned into silence, which is just,
Because they value decorum and etiquette so highly.
Yeah, and then...
It's using the corrupt rules of a corrupt society to destroy the corrupt society.
Yep, which is
and the corrupt
lovely.
rules.
And
yes.
part of what part of how Paul is engaging with Philemon about Onesimus.
I love, actually, that this is the shortest book in the Bible, because if it was the length of, like, Galatians or Romans or something, it might be lost in the shuffle. But because it's the shortest book in the Bible, I think that this book gets a little extra attention. And given its topic, I love that, because it's just wonderful. Yeah. So, when we reach verse 5, Paul is giving thanks because of Philemon's love for all the saints, for all Christians, as we might say. I had a conversation some years ago now with a congregation member once about whether you can love a person as a fellow Christian, as love a person as Christ calls us to, and still claim to own them and for them to be your slave. I don't think so.
Definitely not.
No. Last episode, we had a conversation about, I think it was last episode, we had a conversation about whether any of the humans in the Harry Potter universe truly loved Dobby, because even after he wasn't technically a slave, they never really overcame their stereotypes about him.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that they did truly love Dobby, but I do think that some of them wanted to.
Mm-hmm. And I think they had affection for him, but
yes,
not as an equal.
They were trying, they just didn't really know what they were doing about it at the time.
Yeah, that is true. And that is part of why we are against slavery, because you can't enslave people and see them as fully human.
Yeah.
When in verses 10 and 11, Paul is writing to Philemon on behalf of Onesimus, right? He says, I am appealing to you for my child Onesimus, whose father I have become. Now he is indeed useful both to you and to me. And it reminded me of the Chamber of Secrets, when Ron sends a letter on behalf of Dumbledore for Hagrid's release. And in the movies, he sends it with Errol, which makes zero sense, because Errol would be at the Weasley's home. But in the books, I think Dumbledore still sends him to send Dumbledore's letter of release for Hagrid. That was just kind of this beautiful, like, Ron being, like, the errand boy, but, like, Ron being the one to, like, send for Hagrid's release and having a child be in that position. Even though, like, Paul sends
a little child shall live.
Yeah, even though Paul is, like, sending this letter, presumably through someone who is accompanying Onesimus back to Philemon. But
right. And we might also want to point out that when Paul claims to be Onesimus's father, that's a spiritual father, not like some unexpected biological connection.
Really?
Or, well, you never know. But I don't know that we really know how old Paul is at this point. So
do we ever know how old Paul is?
Well, he starts whining about how many decades he's spent in prison and in shipwrecks eventually, doesn't he?
Maybe, I don't know.
Rightfully whining. I mean, goodness knows he earned it, that's fair. But still whining.
He's the one that persecuted Jesus.
Well, not the only one. Yes. Okay. In verse 16, to continue using Dobby as an example, imagine if Dumbledore wrote this letter to the Malfoys, asking them to take Dobby back as a brother instead of as a slave. Because, after all, he is a pure-blooded magical being, right? He is. In some ways, he's more pure-blooded than some people.
Oh, for sure.
By their definition, if they're going to be really, really nitpicky about it, which, by golly, they really want to be. Mm-hmm. And then imagine that they actually did it, okay? This is the level of astonishment at this concept. This is the level of how radical an idea this letter existing in the first place is. Also, I don't really know. I kind of wanted to say when I came up with that example that the situation would be different and it wasn't a great analogy, but I don't really know if it is different or not. Like, is the contempt that the Malfoys had for Dobby, because we know that they had contempt for Dobby. We have no idea what Philemon felt about Onesimus, or what kind of relationship they had previously, other than it just wasn't an equal one at all.
And that Onesimus ran away.
Yeah, right. But, so is the contempt that the Malfoys had for Dobby based on his creature status, or is it really born out of his status as their slave? I kind of think this is a good analogy. I don't really know that we can know how accurate it would be.
Yeah. Well, and I think you can't, right, like, once again, hashtag false binaries. I don't think you can tease apart whether the Malfoys despised Dobby because he was their slave or because he was a non-human magical creature, or as one of my friends has gotten me thinking a more than human magical creature, which makes way more.
Because he can do things humans can't.
Yeah. So I don't think you can tease those two apart. Part of why he is their slave is because he is a more than human magical creature. And that's what the magical humans do to more than human magical creatures. They figure out ways to have power over them, which is what we do as humans.
To different kinds of humans.
To different kinds of humans, and also to more than human creatures.
Yeah.
And so I think I do think it's a good analogy for slavery the way that the United States experienced and enacted it. I don't, like, there's more complexity to slavery in ancient times.
Yeah, biblical slavery and American slavery are two rather but not entirely different things.
Both of them we can look at now and say those are wrong.
Yes.
And there was an extra component to slavery in the United States of racism and of like that sort of understandings of superiority that was not as ingrained in the system of slavery in the ancient world.
Right. Because in the ancient world, literally anybody could wind up becoming a slave.
Yeah. And so that, I think, is, like, having Dubby as the like, analogy would probably make sense as, like, a slave who had run away and then was, like, sent back and potentially, like, welcomed back as part of the family is absurd. Like, that would never have happened in the United States. And whether it's because that person was a slave or because that person was of African descent or indigenous is, like, it's a both and. It's again, the false binary, but it is, like, I don't know, it's hard because it's also hard to have this conversation, I think, for the two of us to have this conversation, not only because we are white people and white pastors in the whitest denomination in the United States, but also J.K. Rowling intentionally made house elves as the, like, analogy or metaphor for enslaved peoples.
Right. But she also made them want to be enslaved.
Right, which, like, the way that she did it was super problematic, not just because she, like, took human beings and made them into like, non-human creatures.
Which is what people have been trying to say about people who have been enslaved for literally since that concept began.
I mean, right now, our president is still dehumanizing people of color in a variety of ways. And, like, throughout history, how particular oppressed peoples have been called various different animals.
Yeah.
And so...
And then there's the fact that because Dobby is fictional, the emotional weight of that whole thing is... I don't want to make anything less of the emotional weight of actual real-life slavery that has happened, or is happening.
Mm-hmm. So, just to be clear, slavery is terrible. J.K. Rowling is racist, partly because she's just a white person in a system of racism, and partly, like, the way that she constructs the relationship of house elves and magical humans has racism underlying a lot of it. Not to mention how she engages with Indigenous people in the Americas, in her...
Or the whole goblin thing and how anti-Semitic they are.
Yeah. There's a lot of problematic racist tropes in these books.
But I think part of the reason why a lot of those hit us so hard is that they're classic tropes. They've been around for a long time. People keep doing this crap. Mm-hmm. And J.K. Rowling was a classics major. Mm. And I think that might be where she gets a lot of this stuff, because these things have been sins that we've been committing, literally, for a very long time. So she knows how to tap into that narrative power, in a way. But she also doesn't always transform it the way she would hope to.
And I think she doesn't even try to transform it sometimes. But I will say, I think if you are interested in exploring more of the tropes and the racist tropes that J.K. Rowling uses, one of the podcasts that I have really appreciated is A Witch Please podcast, which they've completed the podcast for the most part But they do a good job of going through each book and each movie and then other things and actually like engaging in one of their sections, which they call the Forbidden Forest. They engage in conversation about racism and bodies and the way that those different tropes come out.
The not so hidden messages.
Yeah. So we will include a link to that for sure.
Great.
And then as we continue this passage in verse 17, Paul writes to Philemon, "So if you consider me your partner, welcome Onesimus as you would welcome me." And I was thinking about how Dumbledore actually does Hagrid in his position, right? So he sends Hagrid as if it were his own self to rescue Harry from Godric's Hollow and then to welcome Harry back into the magical world from the Dursley life at the Dursleys in the first Harry Potter book. And this it's different because there's not the same power dynamics, but there's still power dynamics. But this idea of like sending someone in your stead to do your work, and lifting someone up who maybe Hagrid otherwise wouldn't have basically any of the positions he has if it weren't for Dumbledore.
Yeah.
Our gospel reading for this Sunday is Luke chapter 14, verses 25 through 33. Jesus reminds those following him that when God is the most central part of your life, that can and sometimes does mean losing other parts of your life. So one of the themes of this is commitment, particularly commitment in the face of adversity. And Hermione, I think, really embodies this in Deathly Hallows, especially the part that Jesus is talking about where it's commitment to the extent of giving up possessions, that she literally sells a ton of her possessions and in effect like hates her parents, sends her parents away to Australia with erased memories in order to follow this mission and in order to work with Harry to defeat Voldemort. She's like the epitome of the ideal disciple for Jesus.
In that way.
In that way, yes. And as we dive into this passage, we hear from Jesus in verse 26, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, parents, siblings," that sounds more like something Voldemort would say than something we want someone we believe in and someone we value and respect to say. Although I think all sides in the Harry Potter books really do play on family loyalty, whether it's like in the sense of blood purity, but also like loyalty to family in the sense of like the Weasleys and protecting family and those sorts of things. Just not Jesus. Like Jesus doesn't, like, family values is not a thing that is Christian. It's not a thing that is part of following Jesus.
Actually, I find it really interesting that you pointed that out, because to have another fandom history moment, there was a fanfic which has now been taken off the internet, I believe, where there's a scene between Voldemort and Pettigrew, and Voldemort sort of is musing to himself and says, "For God so hated the world that he sent his only son." And Pettigrew tries to correct him, and Voldemort was saying that he was correcting the Bible. So, yeah, that is so on point with that.
Wow.
Yeah. In reading verse 28, there's this whole bit here in this passage, and also in a few recent passages we've discussed, about choice. And as Lutherans, we baptize babies. We say that a person joins the family of God because of what the Spirit does and not what we do. But there still comes a point, or possibly many, many, many repeated points, when a person sits down and weighs whether their faith is worth it or not, for many of us.
Mm-hmm.
And Harry Potter was literally born into the fight against Voldemort. Mm-hmm. That's part of his heritage with his parents. But he also chose it over and over and over mm-hmm. again. It's not a perfect analogy, but he didn't have to keep pushing. He didn't have to keep doing this.
Yeah.
He could have just tried to be a normal student, and he really didn't.
Yeah, well, and that's part of what Dumbledore talks about with him in the prophecy, right? Of explaining why the prophecy will come true is not because it has to come true, but because Voldemort has put store in it, but also because Harry himself will not stop until Voldemort is done, because he has recognized this calling.
Right.
In verse 31, when Jesus says, "Or what king going out to wage war will not sit down first and consider," and I was thinking about like the different considerations that people make in the Harry Potter books, and like Fudge's calculations, Fudge's considerations after the Triwizard Tournament are ridiculous considerations, and he doesn't take into consideration the truth really at all, but he does take into consideration his popularity and the fear and anxiety, right? He is not a non-anxious presence.
Right.
Which was just a really fascinating thing to think about, when in reality Voldemort takes into consideration all of those things. Voldemort is constantly calculating how much power he has compared to how much power the Order of the Phoenix has, compared to how much Fudge and others are like just trying to pretend he doesn't exist, and how to like maintain that. And then when that finally falls, how to navigate it in such a way to still remain behind the scenes so that he holds as many people as possible in the realm of, we don't know what's going on. We don't know how powerful or not powerful Voldemort is. Yeah, so that was just like a fascinating like comparison of who actually like does thoughtful things and is thoughtful and intentional in things. And the reality is Voldemort is thoughtful and intentional and calculating and in considering next steps and next moves a lot of the time. Not all of the time.
But not always.
Not when Harry is actually present. Then it's just like, boom, done. And Fudge is not.
And there are other people who have that reaction to Harry, for that matter. Like, for example, Ron completely throws all consideration out the window when someone is threatening his friends.
True.
In verse 33, we actually get the bit about how you can't truly follow God unless you give up all your possessions. And you had compared this to Hermione, and I'm on board with that. But I also think it's much like how Harry couldn't fully commit to defeating Voldemort unless he was willing to give up literally everything else, including his life. Mm-hmm. We don't get that many examples of people who actually have to make that choice in the world, in the real world. In fiction, actually, it happens a lot. But in the real world, a lot of the people who enter holy orders or the clergy in the Catholic Church follow a vow of poverty on the theory of this verse. Lutherans don't, for a variety of reasons, mostly having to do with wanting to be able to relate to their congregations. But there are still things that we give up. One of the things that we actually have to promise to give up is the concept of going after wealth for wealth's sake, which is why that is such a big thing for us. There are certain actions. That. Oh, that's...
I mean, we're expected not to go after wealth for wealth's sake, but like...
Well, it's stated in one of the formative documents on what being a pastor means. And should look like. That document has other flaws, but it is in there. But there are things that people who enter the clergy, like in whatever denomination, give up. Mm-hmm. And I've had some interesting conversations about them, because, like, one of the things that you give up is the ability to do good by appearing to do bad. Like, once you're in the clergy, your public image matters in a way that it really didn't before. Like, any Christian represents Christianity with whatever they do, but when the clergy do something, there's an extra weight to it, and that impacts the appearance of the church. And so,
well, and I think
even though we don't give up all our possessions, there are still aspects of life we give up.
Well, and I think we do give up like a certain level of anonymity, but also there's a way in which that extra level of public identity and public witness, like the flip side of it is like Reverend Dr. William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign, right? To be arrested in civil disobedience, which is like appearing to do bad, right? By all legal things, not following the law, and yet is for this higher cause and this higher law. And yeah, it's a complicated web, I think, a little bit.
Yeah. Like we've said before, faith is not necessarily easy, but that doesn't stop it from being an overall good.
Well, and I think, as has been in the news recently for us, and we're recording this more in advance of when it'll come out than usual, but I can't imagine this will all of a sudden not be in the news. But one of the things, so I'm currently serve as the social justice pastor for a multicultural, bilingual, reconciling congregation here in Des Moines, and one of the things that the lead pastor and I have been talking about and have been thinking about, particularly in how we frame conversations around immigrant justice and immigrant rights, is so frequently, and he's said this several times in different public forums, but so frequently parents talk about how they would do anything for their children. And for most parents in this country in particular, not very much is really required, right? There's a certain amount of like financial contribution and like life adjustment and stuff, but you're not required to risk very much in order to raise your kid and keep your kid safe and give your kid a great life, particularly for white folks. And yet we see families making these arduous journeys and crossing the border and crossing rivers and crossing deserts, and all for the sake of their kids and their family and the ways that they truly are willing to live into that I would do anything for my kid, that there is so much courage and love and bravery in what they do. And the national conversation almost always completely misses that perspective, and it's such a valuable perspective to hold when we talk about like what it means to follow God, but in particular what it means to give up everything, to give up all your possessions, to risk your life in real and concrete ways for the sake
to really let Voldemort kill you in order to protect your child's life.
And that's what people are doing when they are trying to come to this country, not because this country is treating them at all well, but because this is the last hope.
Or on a slightly lighter note, to also compare it to the Harry Potter universe, another thing, I had an interesting conversation with a clergy colleague many, many years ago now, so I don't actually remember the guy's name, but if you're listening to this, please get in contact, about how people will say that they'll do anything for their spouse, they'll do anything for God, that's what love means. And then they'll say, but my spouse always wants to watch this one TV show and I just hate it. Or, but I want to come to church more often, but I am so bored. And the pastor liked to reply, so you'll do anything for your spouse or for God, but be bored for an hour?
Yes, I have heard that too.
The other person never has an answer to that one. And when you think about it, both Harry and Ron were totally willing to do that to defeat Voldemort, because they were willing to be horribly bored while Hermione made them do all this research. They were willing to truly do anything to defeat Voldemort because they were willing to be bored. They were willing to do stuff they didn't like. And I love that as an example of what being willing to do anything means, because we're so often willing to go to the dramatic and the exciting as examples, but we don't tend to go towards the boring and the ordinary and the not exciting examples.
Although, to be fair, Ron is not quite willing to do anything. He reaches a point where he's like, nope, too much boredom, too much sitting around, not enough doing things, I'm out.
Although, to be fair,
he's hungry, which matters a lot.
Right, and feeding yourself means that you can... Well, and feeding yourself means that you can do research better, and taking breaks while you're researching means that you can do research better. So he has a point. You have to take care of yourself while you're doing the work, too. Self-care is important, Emily.
You and your love of Ron.
See, that time I was goading you just a little bit.
Yeah, I got that.
Our final Sunday for this episode is the 14th Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Proper 19, also known as Lectionary 24, which this year will fall on the 15th of September. Our first reading is from Exodus chapter 32, verses 7 through 14. While Moses is receiving the commandments from God on Mount Sinai, God gets upset because the Israelites have made an idol of a golden calf and are worshipping it. Moses convinces God not to smite them.
I love how you phrased that. Moses convinces God not to smite them.
Smite is one of those words I really want to be able to use more often,
right?
so I will just take advantage of it when it comes
love
up.
the word
Yes,
smite.
it's a good
I think
word.
It's great. The theme that I noticed was accompaniment, even in anger. And I think as Lutherans and members of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, accompaniment is a big part of how we talk about what it means to do ministry with global partners, and in general, what it means to be in ministry together, to be following Christ together. And in this case, it's this beautiful example where frequently we talk about God like coming down to a human level, but this is Moses accompanying God. And so there's this beautiful way in which it embodies accompaniment as a thing that happens between and across different situations of power and privilege, and it's complex when that happens. But I love the way that Moses accompanies God in God's anger and doesn't leave God in the angry place. And of course, whenever we talk about anger, we have to talk about Order of the Phoenix and Harry Potter.
All caps all
right?
the time.
And the ways that Hermione and Ron don't leave Harry alone, at least not for long. They'll like give him a little bit of space to cool off, but they don't leave him in his anger all of the time. They continue to come back and to meet him there. And there's a way in which they don't, like, there's no name for it. They don't know what PTSD is, but they know that he's been having such a difficult time and catching no breaks. And so they know to cut him some slack and to continue to meet him there and kind of coax him back from his edge of all caps.
Yeah. In verse 7, there's a saying among a lot of the clergy that I know, and it's probably not exclusive to clergy, but we're just the ones that happen to use it a lot, where something will happen and we will respond to that by saying, this is not what Jesus died for. And in this verse, God sounds to me like God is saying, this is not why Jesus is going to die for you. And I can totally see Harry as a young adult after the books finish, reading the prophet one day and being frustrated at the ministry doing something stupid and saying to Ginny that he did not die for this crap. So I like that mental image.
Nice. I don't know if I totally understand the, like, God saying this is not why Jesus is going to die for you, but I do like the connection of, like, this is not why I die. I didn't die for this. That's beautiful.
Yeah, God is just really frustrated with the Israelites, and I can kind of feel the frustration of God as, you don't even know what's, going to happen next, guys. Come on. You're better than this. And that sounds to me like God is saying.
Okay. Yeah. I was really confused because I was like, Hebrew Bible, Jesus, what?
I may have jumped the tracks a bit there. Okay.
I get it now more. But I really do like that. I didn't die for this. Like, I could totally see Harry just being like, this is not why I died. And, like, just playing the I died for you card for, like, all of the magical
Can you imagine Harry as a parent?
Oh, my gosh.
Well, have you died for the Wizarding World lately? No? Okay, then.
Yes. That is brilliant. Going back, to the golden calf piece, and that they have cast for themselves an image of a calf and worshipped it and sacrificed to it. It will come probably as no shock to any of our listeners that I thought of the Fountain of Magical Brethren, because that in so many ways is the golden calf of the magical world. It is the thing that they have created to be the embodiment of who they are, and to not only to embody it, but to be this visual thing that they look up to and revere, to the extent that, like, Harry's first time seeing it and he knows there is reverence and awe to be had there, even when he also knows that it's total crap, because that's not how any of the other of the more than human creatures would actually be, except for perhaps the house elf. Yeah, and so that just feels like the golden calf of the magical world to me.
Yeah.
Then we continue, and Moses calls God back to their true self and to the heart of who God is. And that reminded me of Sirius when he talks to Remus in the movie Prisoner of Azkaban, when Remus has forgotten to take his wolfsbane potion and is transforming into a werewolf because the full moon is coming out. And Sirius says, "Remus, my old friend, have you taken your potion tonight?" And then he goes, "You know the man you truly are, Remus. This heart is where you truly live. This heart here. The flesh is only flesh." And it's like this super overly dramatic, as I read it right now, thing. But like this calling back to like, no, destruction is not your best self. Your love and your compassion is your best self.
I also kind of read that as Sirius trying to find humor in the whole werewolf situation without actually making fun of Remus for being a werewolf.
What do you mean?
He is going over the top. He is being overly dramatic, and that totally strikes me as the kind of thing that a guy who had to stop his emotional maturity at the age of like 20 because he got stuck in Azkaban for 13 years. It totally strikes me as the kind of thing that he would do to try to cheer his friend up.
While he's in the middle of transforming into a werewolf?
As we have mentioned before, Sirius is not always the king of mature decision-making.
That's fair.
And I don't see him being overly dramatic just for the sake of being overly dramatic. That strikes me as the kind of thing that he would specifically do to Remus in order to, for another reason.
Because he loves him.
Sure. I would also point out that Remus does actually transform into a werewolf after that, so not a perfect analogy, but there is no such thing. And when I read verse 12, so if Harry just said to Ginny, over reading the prophet at breakfast one morning, that he did not die for this crap, verse 12 is when Ginny reminds Harry that these are still the people that he died for. Look, God has a lot on God's plate. I'm not going to begrudge God the occasional temper tantrum. I have several myself. That's totally fair. So,
I love that. Ginny being like, but you did die for them. Maybe not for this particular situation, but for them.
But these are the people you died for. I have to imagine she would be married to Harry for about 5 minutes before she finally came up with that line, so she could snap back at him when he brought it up.
I mean, that's depending on how long it takes Harry to actually, like, come up with the line himself. Because I can see him, like, not actually coming up with that line for a little while. I think it would take him a little bit.
Maybe the twins come up with it for him.
Well, not the twins, but
come on, Harry,
George,
you didn't die for this. Yes, George. I try my best to forget that part.
I noticed.
And then you just ruin it for me.
I'm just here to bring you back to reality in
good.
the Harry Potter books.
Yeah, that's not really... That makes about as much sense as the rest of our conversations.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of making sense, 1 Timothy, eh?
In which Emily suddenly becomes Canadian.
Oh my gosh, it's getting to loopy time, folks. Our second reading for this Sunday is 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 12 through 17. The author reminds the readers of their own previous disobedience to Christ, in order to remind them that Christ's grace is for all those who actually need grace. So a theme for this passage that I noticed was grace, particularly for ignorance, for when people acted out of unknowing, out of ignorance. And I don't know that anybody can truly and fully claim ignorance in the magical world. Like, maybe when it comes to conflicts between the magical humans and goblins, because they all slept through history of magic, and so they don't understand, like, what actually happened.
Yeah.
Except for Hermione, of course. But I don't know, it's hard for me to think of any examples in the magical world, in the Harry Potter books, where there's, like, someone who truly is ignorant and does harm out of ignorance, and then, like, receives forgiveness, or acts out of ignorance, and then...
I don't know about the forgiveness part, but in terms of acting out of ignorance, I could make an argument for Crabbe and Goyle. Like, they don't really seem to fully understand anything that's going on around them. They're just doing what Draco tells them, because that's what they do. And partly that might be because fandom has a real tendency to make them like Draco's actual puppets in fanfiction. But
similarly to how Ron and Hermione
there
were
are different theories about
literal
how much
mops in Puffs the musical.
But there's a fair amount of debate about, like, both of them not being as aware / intelligent / capable of taking care of themselves in fandom, and that varies a lot.
Yeah.
So
that's like I don't know about that one, but
yeah, that can get complicated. But
interesting.
I mean, at least when they're really, really young, like while they're still 11 and 12
sure.
and maybe 13,
I think 11-year-olds.
They don't understand the larger repercussions of what they're doing.
And maybe that's why it's such a struggle to find anyone who acts out of ignorance, because the books take place over the course of 7 years. Yeah. There is time that everyone is given the opportunity to learn and to grow and to do better, and they don't always do that.
Right.
Maybe, Hagrid, when he acquires Norbert, who becomes Norberta, he is telling the person who's cloaked about the magical creatures he deals with so that they know that he can handle a dragon's egg, and out of ignorance, just not thinking about it, he tells them about Fluffy, the 3-headed dog, and how to soothe Fluffy, and that actually feels like a space where he does act out of ignorance, and then...
Yeah, that's fair. And he does get forgiven.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very good.
So in verse 12 we read that Jesus judged the author faithful and appointed the author to Jesus' service. And this is weird because I feel like this episode I'm using a lot of Voldemort analogies, but that's kind of what Voldemort does with Wormtail in Goblet of Fire, when they're all circled up and he's been resurrected and everybody's gathered around, and he kind of derides Wormtail a bit, but then is like, yes, you're right, you have started to repay your debt, like, you've started to be faithful to me, and so, okay, you can be in my service. To the extent that, like, then in Deathly Hallows, like, he's still a servant, very clearly subservient to the other Death Eaters, because he's serving Snape, and then he's serving the Malfoys in Deathly Hallows, but...
Although, if you wanted a non-Voldemort example, I would say that Dumbledore definitely judged Hagrid faithful and appointed him to his service. I think faithfulness is one of Hagrid's biggest characteristics.
That's true.
And I did not mean the biggest part as a pun, but...
So then we get to the piece where the author says, even though I was formerly a blasphemer, a persecutor, and a man of violence, but I received mercy. And I actually thought of Snape for that part, that Snape was a blasphemer and a persecutor, right? He was on the wrong side, and he was, right, he called Lily Evans a mudblood, and he was doing things that caused harm and persecuted people and caused violence. But then he did receive mercy from Dumbledore.
Yeah. And when I read that verse, I noticed that all the things that the author lists hurt his relationships. A persecutor hurts your relationships with the community. A man of violence hurts your relationships with the people you're violent toward or their families or so on. And blasphemy hurt his relationship with God. True atheists really don't have any concept of blasphemy, because if there is no God, then you can't hurt your relationship with God. But much like how after the Second Voldemort, after people are finally really truly sure that Voldemort is actually dead this time, they really won't be afraid of saying his name anymore, because there's not anything to be afraid of if he doesn't exist.
True. I actually wonder if people really will start saying Voldemort again.
I have to imagine that Harry's going to keep pushing it.
I think Harry will keep pushing it. I think it'll be when George and Weasley Wizard Wheezes make jokes about it.
That's
then it starts to be, which they could have and maybe should have done since the beginning, right? Like Moldemort and the ways that undermines him. But I think that's when people will really stop. Like, it won't be right away.
Oh no, it'll take a while. And then in verse 14, we hear that God's love and grace overflows. There was a controversy in the early church about Christians who had been persecuted and submitted to Roman demands to acknowledge other gods, whether because of torture or threats to their family or so on. And the controversy was, could they receive communion and truly be welcomed back into the church? Or had they ever left in the first place, really? And eventually, the answer was that God's grace has no limits, so yes, they have to be, if they are repentant, they are allowed to receive communion, and they are fully and completely welcomed back into the church. Now, there were those who wanted to keep them out. and repentance or not, just like they can never really truly be trusted again. And the people who said that were called Donatists. This was declared the Donatist heresy. And this heresy still pops up on a regular basis these days, whether or not you can be a true Christian.
Mm.
And I am sure that after the Second Volda War, the magical world is going to have to deal with much the same thing.
Mm.
Can a person who
Like
somehow gave in to the Death Eaters, can they truly be welcomed back in? Can they truly be trusted again? Can they truly be given grace?
Well, and I think
that's
a piece, part of how that plays out in Christianity, right, is not just like, when you mess up, can you be welcomed in again, but particularly for the Volda War and stuff, like, and the way that the church works when people break relationships and when people, particularly people with power and privilege, harm other people, and it's so quickly Christians want to move to reconciliation in the sense of making it disappear and skip over the like real heart-to-heart struggle of this is how your actions have harmed other people.
But not everyone that the Donatists wanted to throw out had power and influence. You're the one who brought up the Malfoys. I was more thinking like Xenophilius Lovegood.
Oh.
Who had no power in his situation and who did submit to the Death Eaters somewhat.
Yeah, I would totally, he'd be back in the fold.
Right.
But I think for the ones who had more power,
you have to admit both ways.
You have to, but also like for the ones who have more power, you have to like put things in place that remove them from the thing that they abused, right? Like where Snape isn't allowed to be Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. And I don't think it's just because it's cursed and so he'll only be there for a year.
Right.
But I do think that he has to, figure out what it means that is the place where he abused power and he abused his own responsibility as a human being to fellow human beings. And similarly, like, if you're abusing power, then the way that we fix that is you don't get to be in those places of power anymore. Like, you're welcome back in the church, but, like, you probably can't ever be a pastor again if you abuse your pastoral authority.
We would hope.
Yeah, we would hope. Not always great at doing that, but... Mm-hmm.
Our gospel reading for this Sunday is Luke chapter 15, verses 1 through 10. Jesus tells the parables of the lost sheep and the lost coin, showing that God's joy over finding someone who was lost is even greater than God's joy over those who were never lost.
So the theme that came up for me in this passage was radical inclusion, where, right, like the extravagant, over-the-top, most ridiculous way of, like, making sure everyone is a part of something is literally leaving 99 sheep to go find one that is lost, turning the house over for one coin, and then going a step farther and, like, throwing a party to celebrate having found those things, and, like, killing more than just one sheep for the party, and spending more than one coin for the party.
Yeah.
So it's just, like, this extravagant vision of what it could be to be all together in community. And it made me think of Order of the Phoenix meetings, that there's a limit to how radically inclusive those meetings are, right? Like, they include werewolves, and they want to reach out to giants, and they want to reach out to werewolves and stuff, but they never include giants in their meetings. They never include Dubby in a meeting. They never include goblins in a meeting. They never include centaurs in a meeting. And I think had they really built their efforts in diversity in such a more intentional form of diversity and inclusion than what they did.
In a systemic way,
right? The conversations and the work of the Order of the Phoenix could have been so much more effective and so much deeper, right? Where we wouldn't have, after the Second Volda War, we wouldn't have Cursed Child because nobody addressed all the stuff that was still messed up after the first two wars, because they would have been building already something that incorporated all of these different perspectives and very clearly and concretely valued those different perspectives. And then, right, like, the amount of knowledge that house elves must know.
Yeah.
That would have been such a help to the Order of the Phoenix in
About all the pure-blooded families and the hidden secrets and the hidden passages, like literal hidden passages.
Right?
Yeah.
Or like to be able to gain wisdom from the centaurs and to know from goblins like how the Death Eaters are like manipulating and damaging and like causing problems for Gringotts and utilizing Gringotts and all of those things. And like, I don't know, there's just so much more potential for that whole movement if they had been intentional about systemic inclusion and diversity.
Yeah.
And then as we get into the passage in verse 4, Jesus poses the question, which one of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost? Well, most people probably would not, because that is not the logical thing to do. The logical thing is to, like, cut your losses and keep the 99. But you know that Hagrid would totally go after the one that was lost. Especially if we're talking, like, magical creatures and it was, like,
a flobberworm.
An Abraxan. Maybe not a flobberworm.
Oh, come on. If there's anybody in the books that would totally go hunting after the one flobberworm that very slowly tried to crawl away from the other 99. It's not like anyone else would, but Hagrid might.
Hagrid might, but I think he would be more excited about going after, like, the missing Abraxan
yes.
or something. But yeah, I think Hagrid would for sure do that. And in the similar vein, right, the woman who lost one of the 10 silver coins, like the Malfoys would just be like, meh, lost a coin, oh well. Yeah. And admittedly, like, the coins are extremely valuable, but Molly would definitely turn the house over for the coin. I think she is very intentional about that, and like there's a way that points to the financial scarcity that she lives with.
Speaking of verse 8, I preached on this text a couple months ago for a congregation that is on the narrative lectionary, so not the RCL that we're using for this podcast. And I took great joy in that sermon in repeating the phrase, God is like a woman, as many times as humanly possible. Which now makes me realize when I try to take that phrase and compare it to how it would show up in the Harry Potter world, how many men in the Harry Potter world would freak out if I took out the word God and put in their name in God's place in that sentence. So-and-so is like a woman. Toxic masculinity. Yeah. Thankfully, God does not see femininity as an insult. And let's also remember the difference between a simile and a metaphor in that God does not have gender. But I did take great joy in saying the phrase God is like a woman over and over again, and there are so many of the men in the Harry Potter world that would hate it if I said that about them.
Yeah, well, and like in our current culture, it would still be that case, but that reminds me of the phrase like you play like a woman, you throw like a woman, and now with the way like that sports are working with U.S. soccer, with tennis, all of these things where like women are incredible athletes, and it's like you can say like one of the things that I've seen people encourage is like somebody says like you throw like a woman or you play like a woman, and then the response is like, yeah, let's hope like if you work hard enough maybe you can too, or something like that. That's like turning the insult around to be like, do you not get that women are like the most incredible athletes in this country right now? Because we are. Because they are.
There was a fun interplay like that in my high school, because the vast majority of our sports teams at my high school were fairly terrible performance-wise, with the exception of the women's soccer team, who just won trophy after trophy after trophy. But did we have multiple pep rallies for the women's soccer team? No, we kept having them for the football team, which I think won a grand total of 2 games in my entire high school career. So one of them was a homecoming game, and believe me, we were all stunned. But I still don't know how that one happened. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's definitely still an ongoing thing. Yeah. And then in verse 10, which talks about repentance, we never actually see in real time a Death Eater repent and turn the other way. We hear about Snape's repentance, but we don't actually really see that whole process for him. To a lesser extent, we hear a bit about Regulus, but it would have been so interesting to see a full face-heel turn kind of repentance in the books from someone. I don't really think that Draco or his parents truly work as an example of that. We see snippets of it. We see the them running around together in the full narrative.
But they're not really repenting.
In this,
right?
Yeah,
like they're not repenting.
It's not really a full
what
repentance story.
Was wrong.
They don't.
They just value.
They figure out
more than
it didn't.
Death Eaterness.
Yeah, so they don't really work as an example. But I mean, imagine if say Draco had truly repented as part of the process, or if one of the other characters had, that could have been a very powerful narrative. But of course it would have taken away from Harry's story and the amount of time that we could spend on that.
Yeah,
so.
And I think Draco would have if Dumbledore had about 5 more minutes with him on top of the astronomy tower.
Yeah, or if Dumbledore had, or another teacher spent a little more time with him far, far earlier in his life.
Yeah, I don't know about that, because even when Snape was, like, trying to support him and stuff.
Yeah, it takes a while to break through that. When parents have put so much effort into creating that shell around their child, it takes a lot to break through that.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we discuss Harry Potter connections to the scripture readings for the 15th through 17th Sundays after Pentecost.
This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Roloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and WordPress, all at HPATCHURCH, HP at Church. Or contact us at HPATCHURCH@gmail.com. This season, we're also putting our episodes on YouTube, where you can listen and see subtitles. So make sure you let your friends know and search for us.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you appreciate what we do or want to be able to go back and listen to older episodes or get actual transcripts of the podcasts instead of just closed captioning, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/HPatchurch. Not only do you get access to special insights or mentions in our episodes, but you'll also be helping us be more accessible and sustainable as a podcast, which is important to us since not everybody has a quick quotes quill.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.